The room smelled faintly of lilies and decay, a bitter reminder of what I had lost. I sat in the pew of the small, almost empty chapel, staring at the polished oak casket where my wife had been laid to rest. It was a strange kind of loneliness, being surrounded by strangers whose faces carried polite sympathy, but no recognition, no shared history. The person who mattered most in this world, my wife, my partner in everything, was gone. And yet, the people who should have been here weren't. No friends. No family. Just me and the strangers who had been hired to play mourners, faces stiff with a performance they didn't understand. My own children, my flesh and blood, had sent excuses. Later, I learned they were demanding I sell the house, the home we had built together, the home that held every memory of her laughter. A lump formed in my throat, not just from grief, but from something sharper, colder betrayal. I remember the day we moved into this house. Her eyes had sparkled like sunlight through the maple trees, and she'd said, "This is it. This is where we'll be happy." I had believed her, believed in the life we were promised. But now, sitting alone in the chapel, that belief felt like a cruel joke. The silence pressed in on me, punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of shoes on stone floors. I realized, bitterly, that grief was not my only companion. Anger had taken root, and it was hungry. I had always been a man who valued trust. I thought I knew people, my family, my friends, my own children. I thought that love, the ties that bound us, were enough to withstand anything. But grief has a way of stripping away illusions. The reality I faced was this: those I loved, those I had protected and provided for, had chosen convenience over loyalty. They wanted the house, the money, the tangible legacy of my life without the effort, without the respect, without the love. I stared at the empty seats where my children should have been, imagining the conversations that might have been laughter, comfort, shared sorrow. Instead, I was left with a quiet fury that hummed in my chest like a living thing. My mind began to wander, tracing every slight, every whisper, every shadow of doubt that had ever brushed against my life. How had I been blind for so long? How had I trusted them to honor her memory, when all they wanted was to capitalize on her absence? As the minister's voice droned in the background, I felt a spark of clarity. Grief could crush a man, or it could sharpen him. And I was choosing the latter. I would not allow this betrayal to define me, nor would I cede my home, my inheritance, or my dignity without a reckoning. There was a path ahead, dark and treacherous, but for the first time since she died, I felt something like purpose. The moral pressed itself into my thoughts. Loss reveals true character, and betrayal is the seed of resolve. And in that hollow chapel, surrounded by strangers, I made a silent promise to myself: those who had abandoned me would not walk away unscathed. I didn't have to wait long for the full depth of betrayal to reveal itself. A week after the funeral, the letters began arriving. Legal notices, not condolences. Notices demanding I liquidate assets, transfer ownership, settle what my own children called or legacy. My hands shook as I held the first envelope, my wife's handwriting still haunting the corner of a folded note she had left for me months ago. They hadn't even waited for the mourning period to end. They went straight for the kill. I called them, my voice steady but icy. "What is this?" I asked, though I already knew. "Dad," my son said, his tone sharp, rehearsed, almost professional. "It's time to make decisions. The house, the estate, we can't let it sit here in limbo. We need you to sell." "Sell?" I repeated, the word tasting like ash. "Do you even know what you're asking?" "They want to cash out." My daughter interrupted, voice clipped, as if she were reading from a script written by lawyers rather than blood relatives. "We can't wait forever. It's just business, Dad. Nothing personal." Nothing personal. Those words burned deeper than anything I had felt since she died. My children, the people I had raised, the people I had loved, had reduced the life of our family to numbers on a ledger. They weren't asking, they were demanding. And their demands carried threats I couldn't ignore: legal action, financial leverage, the kind of cold, calculated pressure that stripped away loyalty like bark from a tree. I remember sitting in that living room, staring at the house I had built, the rooms echoing with laughter and arguments, memories stitched into the very walls. It was as if the house itself was whispering at me, pleading for justice, for someone to defend it. And for the first time I realized something dangerous: I was alone. Not just alone in grief, but alone against my own blood. I replayed every interaction over the past months, every subtle maneuver, every favor asked, every hesitation in their eyes when they thought I wasn't looking. The signs had been there. I had been blind. And now the cost of that blindness was manifesting in the most personal of betrayals. There was no sudden explosion, no dramatic confrontation, just the quiet, calculated intrusion of greed. And in that quiet, I felt a fury that had nothing to do with grief anymore. It was pure, unfiltered, and razor sharp. I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let the cold clarity wash over me. If they thought they could take what was mine, manipulate me into surrender, I would show them just how wrong they were. They would learn that betrayal is not just an act, it's a provocation. And when provoked, some men respond not with tears, but with strategy. The moral settled in my chest like stone. True betrayal is never loud, it whispers, and its sting is felt most sharply by those who trusted. I opened my eyes, staring at the papers on the table, the threats, the demands, the audacity, and a single thought crystallized: revenge wasn't just an option anymore. It was a necessity. Night after night, I lay awake in the dark, listening to the walls of the house creak like old bones, wondering how my life had fractured so completely. Anger roared through me, hot and insistent, yet it clashed violently with grief, with the aching hollow left by her absence. I could feel her everywhere, her perfume lingering on a scarf, her laugh hidden in the corners of the kitchen. But my children, they were gone. They had chosen cold ambition over love, strategy over family. I caught myself speaking aloud to empty rooms, arguing with shadows, rehearsing conversations that would never happen. "How could you?" I would whisper to the ceiling, to the air between the walls. Sometimes it felt as if the house itself answered, sighing with the weight of memories, as though it shared my pain and my fury. I struggled with the morality of what I wanted to do. Revenge is a dangerous companion. It can consume a man completely if he lets it. Was I allowed to think such dark thoughts? Was I justified in planning to dismantle their lives, little piece by little piece, just because they had the audacity to betray me? My rational mind cautioned me. Family is sacred, blood is binding. But my heart screamed a different truth. Blood alone did not protect loyalty. Respect had been severed, and with it, any moral restraint I once clung to. I began journaling, not to sort out the grief. There was no sorting, but to map the contours of my outrage. Each entry traced the moments of betrayal, cataloging the legal threats, the cold words, the refusal to honor my wife's memory. I imagined conversations with them, their faces tight with surprise, as I exposed their ambition, their manipulation. I imagined watching them stumble under the weight of consequences they had never considered. Yet, in the same breath, doubt crept in. Could I truly hurt them? Could I turn my pain into a weapon and risk losing the last shred of humanity I had left? Every plan I considered felt like a moral tightrope over a pit of fire. One misstep, one miscalculation, and I could fall into the very darkness I sought to wield against them. And then the memory of her struck me, sudden and sharp, her eyes full of trust, her hands holding mine as we spoke of love, of family, of building something permanent together. I realized that I was not plotting revenge merely for myself, but for her memory, for the sanctity of the life we had dreamed of and the house that still held her essence. The moral settled in my mind. Pain can blind, but purpose can illuminate. The darkest thoughts often arise from the deepest loss. I finally understood something fundamental. I couldn't act recklessly. This wasn't just grief or anger. It was strategy. Every emotion had to be measured, every reaction calculated. My children thought they had the upper hand. They thought my sorrow would keep me passive. But I had learned something in those sleepless nights. The mind sharpened by betrayal can be far more dangerous than the anger of the moment. And as I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, I made a quiet vow to myself. I would rise from this grief not broken, but sharpened. And when the time came, they would see the cost of underestimating a man who had nothing left to lose but his dignity. The first step in any revenge is patience, I reminded myself, and patience requires observation. I began watching my children, not in the intrusive way a parent might check up on teenagers, but as a strategist might observe opponents. Every phone call, every social media post, every passing comment about money or ambition became a piece of a map I was drawing in my mind. I needed to know where their weaknesses lay, where the cracks in their armor were. I started small. The house, the one they demanded I sell, was the perfect place to begin. It wasn't just property, it was history, memory, and leverage. I studied its value, the mortgage, the insurance, and even small legal loopholes I had ignored while I was blinded by trust. I realized that I had power they underestimated, the power of knowledge and the power of patience. My plan couldn't be impulsive. Revenge, I knew, had to be methodical. One misstep, one emotional burst, and I risked blowing the entire strategy. So I wrote everything down: notes, diagrams, timelines. I listed the financial dependencies they had, the relationships they relied on, even the people they thought they could manipulate. I began envisioning scenarios where each of their moves could be anticipated, redirected, or turned against them. I also dug into my own resources. Friends I had distanced myself from, colleagues I had once trusted, lawyers who owed me favors. Each became a tool, an ally, or a source of information. The more I gathered, the more my confidence grew. I was no longer a grieving man at the mercy of betrayal. I was becoming a player in a game my children didn't even realize they were part of. Yet, in the midst of planning, I had to confront the darker parts of myself. Every night, as I traced the edges of my strategy, I asked, am I becoming the person I despise? The answer was always the same, perhaps. But there was a difference between me and those who betrayed me. My actions would be deliberate, intelligent, precise. There would be no reckless cruelty, no destruction for destruction's sake. This was about justice, about balance, about teaching a lesson they would never forget. I began to rehearse conversations in my head, phrases that would unsettle them, questions that would expose greed, timing that would make their reactions predictable. I imagined them realizing, too late, that the game was not in their favor. And with every rehearsal, the anger that had once been chaotic began to sharpen into clarity. The moral became clear: revenge without preparation is folly. The patient mind wields more power than the impulsive heart. By the time the first week of observation passed, I was ready. The pieces were in place, the board set, and my patience had honed a weapon sharper than any impulse. I would strike not in blind fury, but with deliberate precision. And when I did, they would discover something they had forgotten in their hunger for inheritance: that betrayal carries consequences, and that even children can fall to the very hands that once nurtured them. And in the quiet of the night, I whispered to the empty house, a vow to both the memories it held and the life I had lost: they will pay, but on my terms. The first move had to be subtle, almost invisible, a whisper of disturbance, something that would unsettle without revealing my hand. I started with small disruptions in their lives, legal and financial nudges that would make them second guess their certainty. I knew my children relied on the illusion of control, and illusions, when fractured, are far more destabilizing than brute force. It began with the house. I discovered an obscure clause buried deep in the mortgage agreement, a loophole that allowed me to impose a temporary hold on the sale. One carefully worded letter to their lawyer, and suddenly their plans were stalled. They called me, irritation dripping from every word. "Dad," my son said, trying to mask panic with arrogance. "What's going on? This was supposed to be done last week." I checked the details, I said evenly. "Looks like we need to slow down, make sure everything's in order. We wouldn't want mistakes, would we?" His silence told me more than words ever could. He hadn't anticipated resistance. He hadn't anticipated me. Next, I leveraged their social circles. I subtly exposed minor, inconvenient truths about financial mismanagement they had thought hidden, not publicly, but to people whose opinions mattered to them: investors, colleagues, even a few close friends. Whispers reached their ears, and they began to feel that creeping paranoia, the kind that gnaws at confidence. It's one thing to know a parent is angry. It's another to feel the web tightening around you, invisible but undeniable. I wasn't cruel, at least, not unnecessarily. Every move was calculated to sow doubt, not devastation. I wanted them to feel the psychological weight of their actions before they ever faced anything more direct. I wanted them to understand that betrayal had consequences beyond money, beyond property, beyond legal documents. There is a satisfaction in watching arrogance crumble quietly, like a building with termites you never see until the floor collapses. But as the days passed, I realized something important. The smallest victories are intoxicating. Each moment of hesitation in their voices, every glance of uncertainty, fed a fire in me I hadn't expected. Grief had honed into strategy, strategy into action, and action into a growing sense of control I hadn't felt in months. I found myself pacing at night, rehearsing the next steps, imagining their reactions. I caught myself smiling at subtle victories, the way my daughter paused mid-sentence when an inconvenient fact came up in conversation, the way my son hesitated before sending an email he had drafted with confidence. It was not cruelty, it was justice. They had underestimated me, and that mistake would cost them more than they imagined. The moral became stark in my mind, even the smallest. Well-placed action can turn the tide. Patience and precision are often stronger than anger. And as I sat in the quiet of my study, listening to the wind whisper against the windows, I knew this was only the beginning. The chessboard was set, the pieces moving, and my children were already stepping into the traps I had laid. The taste of control, the anticipation of retribution was addictive and necessary. For the first time since her funeral, I felt alive. And I knew, deep down, that my next moves would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about me. By the time I made my next move, the tension had become almost tangible. I could sense it whenever they were in the same room as me, a subtle, electrical charge that made their eyes flicker with uncertainty. My children, once confident in their entitlement, now hesitated, second-guessing every word, every action. And that hesitation, it was exactly what I wanted. I called a family meeting, under the pretense of discussing logistics about the estate. My voice was calm, almost too calm, when I addressed them. "I think it's time we went over everything," I said, spreading the documents across the dining table. Their glances were sharp, defensive. I watched them lean forward, expecting confrontation, expecting me to panic or plead, but I did neither. I had learned something powerful in these past weeks. Authority and composure can be more intimidating than anger. I began slowly, deliberately revealing the consequences of their impatience. "I've reviewed all the financials," I said, letting the words sink in. "And there are discrepancies. Accounts that haven't been disclosed, decisions made without consent. It seems some of you have been prioritizing personal gain over family trust." My daughter's hand shook as she reached for her water glass. My son's jaw tightened, the mask of arrogance cracking ever so slightly. They had expected me to be vulnerable, to crumble under the weight of grief. Instead, I was unshakable, a rock amidst the storm they had created. "Do you realize," I continued, "that every move you've made, every demand to sell the house, every attempt to pressure me has consequences you haven't anticipated?" I paused, letting my words hang in the air like smoke. "I've contacted your financial advisors. I've spoken with legal counsel. I've confirmed that if you proceed without full disclosure, there will be repercussions, not just minor ones, but serious ones." Their faces fell. My son opened his mouth, but no words came out. My daughter's lips pressed together in a tight line. The power dynamics had shifted. For months, they had believed they held all the leverage. Now, they realized I had been quietly building my own. I leaned back, my eyes fixed on them, and said something I had never said in anger before. "You thought I was alone. You thought grief had weakened me. But grief sharpens children, and betrayal fuels the mind in ways sorrow cannot." And for a moment I saw the fear, the understanding that they had underestimated me. The arrogance of entitlement had collided with the consequences of betrayal, and they were unprepared. The moral was clear, almost cruel in its simplicity. Those who think trust can be taken for granted often fail to foresee the reckoning it can provoke. As I stood and gathered the documents, I felt a strange satisfaction, not in their panic, but in the inevitability of justice. I had turned the tables without raising my hand, without raising my voice. The confrontation had ended not with a fight, but with clarity. Power, patience, and precision were far more terrifying than rage. But even as I walked away from that table, I knew the battle was far from over. The next moves would require cunning, strategy, and a willingness to strike where it hurt the most. And deep down, I welcomed the challenge. The repercussions didn't take long to surface. Within days, I noticed subtle cracks forming in their carefully constructed lives. My son, once brimming with confidence, began making mistakes at work, emails sent to the wrong people, promises he couldn't keep. My daughter's social circle, once a source of pride and influence, started questioning her judgment. The whispers I had sounded months ago had grown into a quiet storm, and it was consuming them. They tried to fight back, of course. Legal threats, veiled accusations, even attempts to manipulate mutual friends and distant relatives. But by now, I had anticipated every move. Every trap they set was deflected or redirected. It wasn't luck or coincidence, it was preparation, patience, and a deep understanding of human nature. I realized that true revenge isn't about chaos, it's about control. It's about creating a domino effect where every piece falls exactly where you intend. At home, the house had become a fortress of memory and power. I spent hours walking through the rooms, touching the furniture she had chosen, the photos we had taken together. The house was more than property. It was a living archive of her life and our love, and they could not take that from me. Each creaking floorboard, each fading wall shadow reminded me why I had started this path, not for spite alone, but to protect what mattered most. Then came the subtle psychological toll. My children, who once flouted me with the arrogance of entitlement, began second, guessing every decision. Calls came late at night, questions asked with hesitation, apologies thinly veiled beneath frustration. I felt a cold satisfaction watching them stumble through uncertainty. Every day, they felt a fraction of the fear and instability I had experienced when I realized how far their betrayal ran. Yet, even in the midst of satisfaction, a shadow of doubt crept in. Revenge has its own cost. The nights I had spent planning and executing, the obsession with their failures, had left little room for healing. Grief lingered, a silent companion that whispered reminders of what I had lost. I realized that consequences cut both ways, not just for the betrayed, but for the betrayer as well. The moral was unavoidable. Retribution can restore justice, but it does not heal the heart. Every victory carries the weight of what was sacrificed to achieve it. By the time the dust settled, I could see the balance restored. My children had been humbled, made aware of the consequences of their choices. I had reclaimed control over the home, my inheritance, and, in a way, my dignity. But it was not without scars, emotional, psychological, and moral. Revenge had worked, but it had also left me altered. A man tempered by fire, shaped as much by loss as by triumph. And as I sat alone in the living room, staring out at the quiet street, I realized something that no amount of planning or clever strategy could teach. Justice is temporary, but lessons learned through betrayal endure. The storm had passed, but its lessons would linger for a lifetime. In the quiet aftermath, the house seemed to breathe again, as though it had absorbed the tension, the deceit, and now exhaled a long, steady sigh. My children had retreated, their ambitions checked, their arrogance tempered. The estate remained intact. The home, filled with memories of her, remained mine. And yet, victory carried a strange weight, a hollow sense of accomplishment that no celebration could fill. I walked through the rooms, touching objects that had once been mundane: a photograph on the mantel, the corner of a well-worn armchair, a vase she had loved. Each piece reminded me of what I had fought for, not money, not power, but respect for the life we had built together. Revenge had been necessary, yes, but it had never been the ultimate goal. It had been a tool, a means to preserve something far more enduring, the sanctity of memory and the integrity of home. I reflected on the transformation I had undergone. The man who once would have begged for reconciliation or pleaded for understanding was gone. In his place was someone tempered, sharper, capable of cold clarity without losing sight of moral lines. I realized that grief and betrayal had forced me to confront the darkness within myself, and in doing so, I had discovered a resilience I never knew I possessed. Yet the emptiness lingered. The house was safe, but the echo of her absence remained. I could hear it in the silence of the mornings, see it in the spaces where her laughter had once filled the air. The truth was unavoidable. Revenge had restored balance, but it could not resurrect love, nor undo the profound loss that had set this chain of events in motion. I thought about my children, not with hatred, but with clarity. They had made choices, and they had suffered consequences. It was not my role to destroy them entirely, only to ensure that the weight of betrayal was understood, felt, and remembered. In that, perhaps, there was mercy. And in that mercy, I found a strange peace, a final understanding that vengeance without purpose is hollow, but justice tempered with wisdom endures. The moral crystallized, final and unyielding, betrayal reveals character, and revenge, when measured and purposeful, can restore justice. But true healing comes not from retaliation, but from the lessons we carry forward. As I settled into the quiet of the house that had been my sanctuary, I allowed myself to feel the full spectrum of what had happened: the grief, the anger, the meticulous strategy, the satisfaction of seeing justice done. And somewhere deep in that mix, I felt the faintest spark of something like hope. Not hope that the past could be undone, but hope that the future, my future, could be reclaimed, shaped by wisdom rather than by blind trust. I knew finally that life would never be the same. Nothing could bring her back, and nothing could erase the betrayal. But I had survived, sharpened and aware, and I had ensured that the people who had tried to exploit my grief would never forget the consequences of underestimating me. The house was quiet, the storm over, and I understood some battles are won not with fists, but with patience, strategy, and an unflinching will to endure. And for the first time in months, I felt the weight of grief lift just enough to breathe and perhaps, someday, to forgive myself.